Somewhere over Tunisia in the winter of 1943, a bomber hung in the sky, torn open, tail half gone, men praying inside. The engineers said it couldn't fly. The crew said they wouldn't die. For 26 minutes, that plane, a B-17 named the All-American, flew against physics, against fear, and against fate itself. This is not a legend. This happened. The sky over North Africa. The sun had barely risen over the endless dunes of North Africa when the airfield at Biskra began to wake. Dust drifted lazily across the cracked runway as the roar of engines rolled through the morning stillness. Men moved like shadows through the golden haze, tightening bolts, checking maps, loading belts of 50 caliber rounds into the side turrets of bombers lined in rows. The war had turned the desert into an assembly line of death, machines of metal and fire, waiting for another mission that none of them wanted. But all of them would fly. Among them stood a B-17 flying fortress named the All-American. Her olive-drab skin was scarred with bullet holes and faded paint from earlier missions. A cartoon bulldog with boxing gloves grinned from her nose, its edges chipped and worn by desert sand. Inside her belly, 10 men prepared in silence, their breaths visible in the cold dawn air, despite the African heat that would come later. Lieutenant Kendall Evans, just 24, sat in the pilot's seat, adjusting the worn leather of his gloves. He had flown 19 missions before this one. He didn't need the mission briefing to tell him what awaited them. German fighters near Tunis, anti-aircraft batteries dug into the coastal hills, and the long flight home through skies that seemed empty until they suddenly weren't. His co-pilot, Gail Cleven, checked the gauges with steady hands. He had a way of staying calm that made everyone else believe they could too. Behind them, the crew moved through ritual motions born of repetition and fear. Sam Tinian, the tail gunner, cleaned the lenses of his sight with a cloth that was more grease than fabric. "Tail's clear," he muttered. "For now." Sergeant Albert Doc Gibson carried the last crate of ammunition to the waist guns, his uniform darkened with oil. "This crate better be the lucky one," he said. Nobody answered. Luck had run thin weeks ago. At 0700, the engines roared to life. Dust billowed around them as the fortress began its slow taxi toward the runway. One by one, the other bombers followed, forming a column that shimmered through the desert heat. The ground crew watched in silence, small figures waving to giants of metal that they might never see again. As the All-American lifted off the ground, the sun broke fully over the horizon. The desert shrank away beneath them, replaced by open blue sky. In those first minutes, before the mission turned deadly, it almost felt peaceful. The rhythmic hum of the engines, the faint music of wind sliding over wings, the strange beauty of war when it's still distant. They climbed to 15,000 feet. The horizon stretched endlessly, a blur of gold and grey. Somewhere far ahead lay their target, a German supply depot near Tunis. The radio crackled with coded chatter. The men listened, waiting for the words that would turn routine into chaos. Evans glanced to his left. Another B-17 held perfect formation, its silver wings catching the light. For a moment, he thought about how much faith it took to fly like this. 10 men sealed inside a box of steel and fuel, trusting every rivet to hold. Then came the voice over the radio. "Enemy fighters reported at 11 o'clock. Prepare for contact." The peace of the sky shattered instantly. The bombers tightened formation. Gunners swung their turrets toward the glint of approaching aircraft. Black dots on the horizon grew larger, darker, Messerschmitts diving out of the sun, cannons flashing. Tracers streaked past the windows in orange lines. The first burst tore through the wing of the lead bomber, sending smoke spiraling behind it. Evans steadied his voice. "Hold formation. Keep tight." The All-American shook violently as shells exploded nearby. Glass shattered across the cockpit. Evans didn't flinch. "We're hit on the left stabilizer," Cleven shouted. "Still flying!" The air was filled with chaos now. Engines screaming, machine guns hammering, radios barking half-heard words. Below them, the desert rolled by, indifferent to the destruction above. The bomb run lasted less than 2 minutes. Evans released the payload over the target, the plane jolting upward as the weight dropped away. Smoke rose from the distant depot, another small wound in a war full of them, but the mission wasn't over. The real danger came after. As the formation turned home, German fighters dove again. A Messerschmitt came in too fast, riddled with bullets from the tail gunner of another fortress. It caught fire and veered straight toward the All-American. "Brake! Brake left!" Cleveland shouted. Evans yanked the controls, but there was no room to move. The burning German plane clipped the rear of the bomber, a sickening crash of metal against metal. The tail section of the All-American twisted violently. The enemy fighter disintegrated in a flash of debris. For a moment's silence. Then the intercom crackled. "Tinian, report!" Evans called. No answer. The fortress shuddered. The tail hung lower, almost tearing away. The crew stared in disbelief at the jagged hole where the fuselage had been. Through it, the open sky yawned. Cleveland's voice was tight. "We've lost the tail." Evans took a breath that felt like swallowing fire. "No, we haven't," he said. "Not yet." The All-American, ripped nearly in half, somehow stayed in the air. The men stared at the instruments, the needles trembling, but still, impossibly, alive. The mission home had only just begun, the collision and the fall that never came. The first thing they felt was the shove. Not a jolt, not an explosion, an immense, irresistible shove that drove the airplane sideways as if a fist had struck its spine. The cockpit flooded with dust and glittering slivers of safety glass. Evans steadied his hands on the yoke and rode the movement out, waiting for the next sensation, the spin, the drop, the long, helpless fall that always followed a mid-air collision. It didn't come. Behind the cockpit, a howl of wind ripped through the fuselage, raw and hungry. Cleveland leaned out of his seat and looked aft down the narrow catwalk. Sunlight where there should have been shadow. The belly of the fortress had opened somewhere behind the waist guns. He could see the sky framed by torn metal. "Roll left," Cleveland said. Evans tried. The yoke was mush. The airplane responded as though it were full of wet sand. He tried right, nothing. He nudged the rudder pedals, dead. The cable runs to the tail were gone. The interphone crackled with voices. Gibson in the radio room coughing, saying he was all right. De Bolt in the ball turret asking for confirmation. Did we just lose a wing? No, not a wing, worse. "Tinian, talk to me," Evans said. Silence, then a breathless answer, thin with cold. "I'm here." "Condition?" "Tails. Not attached like it used to be." He wasn't joking. The collision had come from above and aft. Another B-17, mauled by flak and slipping out of control, had scythed across the All-American's back like a blade. The vertical fin still stood, but the fuselage around it had been peeled back and twisted. What once was a smooth tube was now a broken reed. The aft end hinged to the forward by narrow, wrinkled arches of aluminum and a few intact stringers. Where the bulkhead should have sealed off the tail, there was open air, and beyond it the tailplane thrashed, eager to tear free. Evans pressed the throttles forward a fraction on the right side. The nose tried to swing left. He eased the left pair up to meet them and found a point where the airplane stopped arguing. Thrust had become steering. He breathed through the oxygen mask and kept the horizon level by fingertip and instinct. Blum crawled into the cockpit and knelt with his map folded under one elbow, eyes wide, face flecked with powdered aluminum. "We're drifting east," he said. "If we can hold a westerly, we can ride the coastline back. If, Evans said. The word had weight. Gibson pushed up from the radio room with a coil of parachute cord over his shoulder. "The tail's sawing," he said. "Every bump it lifts and drops. If it lifts too far—" He didn't finish. "Do what you can," Evans said. They moved like men underwater, slow and deliberate. Gibson and De Bolt crawled to the brake and lashed cord across the torn frame, stringing a crude web between longerons and ribs, pulling until their wrists shook. Each knot tightened, drew a new sound from the airplane, higher, more strained, but the motion in the tail softened from wild to merely desperate. Tinian had worked himself out of the shredded tailgun position and forward into the waist, his face white with cold. He braced his boots against a bent spar and looped cord over it, hauling until the line sang. "It'll hold," he said, as if saying it could make it true. A momentary calm slid over the ship, the deceptive kind that comes not from safety, but from everyone running out of hands. The desert rolled below, ridges like sleeping animals, the Mediterranean a thin blade of steel beyond. Somewhere out there were the airstrips and the tents and the men who would watch a miracle or a catastrophe. The All-Americans sat astride the line that separated the two. Evans experimented. A thumb-width more power on engines 1 and 2, and the nose came right. Ease them back and the nose hunted left. Elevators gone, rudder gone. What remained of control lived in the 4 throbbing circles on the wings. He could not flare, could not bank hard, could not recover from a real upset. What he could do was thread a needle straight ahead. Cleveland kept his eyes on the engine gauges, talking to the airplane the way you coax a stubborn animal. Easy, that's right. Stay with us. Oil pressure held, but the right inboards ran hotter than he liked, the cowl flaps barely enough to keep the needles out of the red. "Fuel?" Evans asked. "Enough," Cleveland said. "Enough if we fly like monks." Blum returned to the nav table and drew a new line with a shaking pencil. He looked older when he came back. "If we can hold 150 indicated and this heading, we make the coast in 20 minutes. After that, another 40 to home." He paused, listening to the airframe groan. "We can't descend fast. The tail won't survive the load." "We won't," Evans said. "We walk her down like glass." A shadow swept the cockpit. Cleveland craned his neck. 2 P-38s slid into loose escort off the left wing, shark-nosed and indifferent to the wind. One waggled gently. On the common frequency, a dry voice. "You boys missing something?" Gibson laughed once, surprised by the sound of it. Evans didn't answer on the radio. He couldn't spare the thought. The presence of the fighters mattered less as defense than as witness. If they went down, someone would tell what they'd tried to do. The airplane developed a new tremor, deeper, more regular. Boom, 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 like a heartbeat felt through the floor. Cleveland crouched and laid his palm on the deck. "Not an engine," he said. "She's breathing." As the ship met each pocket of rough air, the cracked fuselage flexed. The cords hummed. The aft section rose, fell, rose again. Tinian swore softly and bled more line off the coil, tying with his teeth when his fingers stopped obeying. Evans trimmed with power and thought in small increments. "Don't fix the whole sky. Fix the next second." The fortress obeyed when asked, sulked when pressed, and punished any hurry. The sensation of speed dwindled until the world beyond the glass seemed painted on, and the only motion was inside the airplane, the quiver of metal, the twitch of needles, the minute rocking of a head as a man fought to stay awake. The coastline appeared first as a dull stripe, then as light, a change in the way the sun lay on the earth. Blum whispered it before anyone else. "There." An exhale moved through the crew like a rumor. They could not celebrate. The descent would be the most dangerous part. Lose speed and the tail would drop. Gain speed and it might lift so hard it tore. Turn too much and the entire aft end would swing like a door and rip away. There were not many things they could do right and 1,000 they could do wrong. Evans briefed what could not properly be briefed. "No heroics. We come in straight. If the gear won't lock, we slide it. If she starts to pitch, we ride it out with power. Don't move unless you have to. Sam, you stay braced. Roy, keep those lines tight." They crossed the surf line, and the desert opened again, flatter now, the color bleaching toward pale. The airfield was still invisible, but the world felt inhabited. Smoke smudges from cook fires, a sun flash on glass, a road scored into the sand. The P-38 on the left bobbed, and after a moment rolled away. The other stayed, her pilot curious, unwilling to miss the ending. The All-American reached the first hint of pattern altitude in increments. Evans bled power like a miser. The tail answered each change with a complaint. The bomber wanted to sink. He would not let it. Cleveland's voice was the metronome. 148. 150. Hold. A thin line materialized ahead, the runway, dirt over metal, the skin of a drum. Vehicles grew beside it, then men, then faces. The control truck's mast gleamed. Fire crews stood already in place, helmets turning. "Gear," Evans said. Cleven threw the switch. The right wheel dropped and locked with an honest clack. The left hesitated, stuttered, stuck. Gibson left the cords and crawled to the manual pump. He cranked like a man hauling himself up a cliff, each stroke a prayer. The wheel thudded down and the lockpin bit. He didn't cheer. He crawled back to the cords and wrapped them around his wrists again. The runway ran toward them. Evans fixed his eye on a point just short of the threshold and imagined the airplane balancing there, weightless. He could not flare. He could only arrive. "Power," he said. Cleven adjusted, a breath here, a breath there, until the engines sang the same quiet song. The desert wind flattened. The ship stopped arguing and for a moment simply flew. The threshold spilled under the nose. The wheels met the earth with a skip, then a grind. The airframe sagged. The tail struck and dragged, and for one long second the airplane decided whether it would remain a single thing or become two. It stayed whole long enough to roll. Somewhere behind them, metal screamed and let go, and the aft section slid away in a spray of sparks. The rest of the bomber coasted, slowing, quieting. The engine notes fell an octave and then another, and the world around them, men running, trucks pacing, came back into focus. Evans lifted his hands from the yoke. The imprint of the leather had pressed crescents into his palms. Cleven leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. No one spoke. They sat inside the sudden absence of motion and tried to understand it. When the hatches opened, heat and voices poured in. Medics waited with blankets they didn't need. Mechanics stared into the broken center of the ship and shook their heads as if the angles offended geometry itself. Denian slid down to the dirt and stood a moment with his hands on his knees, then straightened and looked for the tail he had held by string and stubbornness. It lay 50 yards behind, a separate object now, already a relic. They did not slap backs or shout. They counted each other, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10, and watched the realization move across their faces in the same order. The war waited just beyond the fence, in the silhouettes of other ships lining up to go, in the black smudges on the horizon where today would happen again. But for a few minutes on a strip of desert, the sky had taken its shot and missed. The All-American sat in the sun, less a bomber than a question answered. Evans turned once to look at the wreck and felt gratitude toward metal, which did not owe them mercy and yet had granted it. Then he stepped down to the dirt with the others and let the airplane rest. The longest flight home. For the first half hour after the collision, nobody said much. The wind had a voice of its own now, whispering through the ripped skin of the fuselage, carrying the smell of burnt metal and cordite. The men of the All-American were learning to listen to their airplane in a new way. Every groan of the frame, every tremor underfoot, was a word in a language they had to learn fast. Evans held the controls as gently as a surgeon holding a pulse. The yoke felt spongy, the resistance inconsistent, like steering through mud. Whenever he tried to correct their heading too sharply, the entire rear section swayed, bending against its remaining supports. The bomber was alive, but fragile, like a wounded animal that would bolt if pushed. Behind him, Cleven checked the instruments again and again, looking for any small betrayal in the needles. Engines holding. Temps steady. Oil good, he said, his voice measured. He didn't say what they were both thinking, that one bad vibration could shake the tail loose completely. In the waist section, Gibson and DeBolt worked in silence. They had tied off every length of parachute cord they could find, securing the shattered frame where it met the tail. The cords trembled like harp strings. It wasn't engineering. It was desperation dressed up as hope. Sam Tinian stayed near the brake, sitting with his back to the gun mount, his legs braced on either side of the torn aluminum. The sunlight came straight through the hole behind him, and the wind tugged at his flight jacket. He had a view no gunner was supposed to have. The desert spinning slowly below, the tail of his own plane drifting slightly out of line like a kite on a loose string. "Still with us, Sam?" Evans asked through the interphone. "Still here," came the answer. Can't say the same for the rest of the tale. That got a few dry laughs, the kind men used to cover fear. Cleven tapped the compass. We're holding southwest. If we keep this heading, we should find the coast soon. Evans nodded, though the motion meant little now. He flew by instinct and the feel of the air. The bomber moved differently, slower to respond, almost thoughtful. The fortress had lost her symmetry, but not her will. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the desert changed color beneath them, from gold to white, to an unforgiving glare that erased the horizon. The air shimmered. Somewhere far ahead lay the Mediterranean, and beyond that, home. After an hour, fatigue began to settle over the crew like dust. The constant vibration, the roar of the wind through the wound in the fuselage, the high, thin air, all of it pressed down. Time became a loop of the same small motions. Tighten the cords, adjust the throttle, listen for changes in the metal. Blum, the navigator, crawled up to the cockpit, his map folded under his arm. "We're still on course," he said, "but if we drop much lower, the tail won't survive the drag." "Keep her high," Evans didn't answer. His jaw ached from clenching. Sweat rolled down his temple, then froze in the air that hissed through the cracked window. "Gale," he said finally, "tell them to check the cables again. Make sure nothing's slipping." Cleven relayed the message. Gibson called back after a moment. "Lines are tight. She's creaking like a haunted house, but she's holding." The next voice came from the radio operator, flat and calm. "Fighters above. Ours." Two silver P-38 Lightnings slid into view, keeping loose formation beside the bomber. Their twin tails caught the sunlight as they matched the All-American's sluggish speed. One dipped a wing in salute. Evans raised his hand briefly in return. For the first time since the hit, he felt something close to relief. They weren't invisible anymore. Someone had seen them. "Escort?" Cleven asked. "Escort," Evans confirmed. "Let's hope they know a miracle when they see one." The fighters stayed close as the bomber limped west. Occasionally, one would fly ahead, banking low and circling back, a gesture of reassurance, or maybe disbelief. The radio crackled with a faint voice from one of them. "You boys missing half your plane?" Evans smiled despite himself. "Only the half we didn't need." The rest of the crew heard it and laughed, quick and short. It didn't last, but it helped. Minutes turned to hours. The All-American crawled across the sky, her engines throbbing unevenly. The sun began its slow descent, the light softening into amber. The coastline finally appeared ahead, a faint blue haze on the horizon. "Coastline in sight," Blum said quietly. Nobody cheered. They were past cheering. Evans looked over the desert one last time, then turned the plane gently toward home. The bomber shuddered but obeyed. "Start descent," he said. "Slow and steady. She's taken us this far. Let's not test her faith." Cleven adjusted the throttles, coaxing the fortress downward. The altimeter needle dropped by slow degrees. The cords holding the tail began to hum louder, a warning in the wind. "Tighten them," Gibson called out. "She's moving!" Denian braced his boots again, his hands white-knuckled around the makeshift supports. "Come on, girl," he muttered under his breath. "Don't quit on us now." The desert airfield was a brown scar in the distance, shimmering through the heat. Trucks and jeeps clustered near the runway, and the faint flash of signal mirrors blinked from the control tower. Evans felt the engines strain under his hands, their rhythm uneven but loyal. "Hold it together," he whispered. The fortress leveled out at 2,000 feet, every seam groaning. They had flown over 200 miles in a plane that should have fallen from the sky within minutes. No one said it aloud, but each man thought the same thing. They were no longer flying by physics. They were flying by faith. 100 miles of hope. The air inside the bomber had turned thin and strange. It smelled of fuel, metal, and fear. Every breath felt like pulling wind through cloth. The All-American had become something less than an airplane and something more than a machine, a living thing limping home on courage and broken bones. Evans hadn't spoken in several minutes. His eyes moved between the horizon and the shaking needles on the instrument panel. The dials trembled like frightened animals. He could no longer trust what they said, only what the air told him through the yoke. Cleven watched him quietly. "You holding up?" he asked. "Ask me when we touch down." The two exchanged a half-smile, the kind that belonged to men who'd seen the worst already and were daring the world to do more. Behind them, the rest of the crew had fallen into a rhythm that wasn't about routine anymore. It was survival choreography. Every man had a job, and none of them could afford to stop. Gibson was tightening the cords again, though his fingers bled. DeBolt passed him lengths of parachute silk, reinforcing the web that held the fuselage together. Tinian remained near the brake, his body braced like a human brace beam. Eyes locked on the sky, rushing past the torn metal. Sometimes the tail dropped, and a shockwave ran through the floor like a heartbeat. Every time, everyone froze. Then the cords sang, the tension held, and the airplane kept breathing. The radio crackled to life. "Biskra control to all American. Do you copy?" Cleven grabbed the mic. "We copy, control. Returning from mission. Aircraft heavily damaged. How bad?" came the reply. Evans leaned toward the mic. "Tail's almost gone. We're holding it together with cords and prayer." There was a pause. Then understood. "Runway's clear. Emergency crews standing by." It was meant to be reassuring. It didn't help. Below them, the desert unfolded in waves of heat and shadow. From this height it looked calm, like nothing deadly had ever happened there. But the crew knew better. They had dropped their bombs into that calm earlier today. The war was always waiting under the surface, quiet until it screamed. Blum came forward, his map fluttering from the wind seeping through the fuselage. "We're 90 miles out," he said. "If she keeps holding, we'll make it." Evans nodded. "She'll hold." "You sound sure?" "I have to be." No one dared to say what they all knew, that the odds were thinner than the air they were breathing. Cleven reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo. A woman standing beside a porch, smiling into the sun. He looked at it for only a second, then slid it back. "Don't you go anywhere," he muttered to the plane. "Not until we're done." The minutes stretched into hours. The sun dipped lower, throwing the desert into long shadows. The world outside turned bronze and then red, like rust spreading across the sky. Evans eased the throttles back, testing how far he could glide without losing altitude. The tail began to sway, slow, almost gentle. "Too much," Cleven said softly. Evans added power again, steadying her. The All-American crept forward, mile after impossible mile. Gibson's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, we've got cables fraying back here." "If they snap, they won't," Evans said. "How can you be sure?" "Because if they do, we don't have time to talk about it." There was silence, then a laugh, short and nervous, but it was something. Cleven checked his watch. 3 hours since the hit," he said. "Feels like 3 days." Evans didn't reply. He just looked out at the horizon. "Let's make it 4. Far below, a convoy of trucks moved across the sand, tiny dots casting long shadows. Somewhere out there, men were fighting their own small battles, unseen. The sky around them had turned soft, almost beautiful, a cruel contrast to the shredded wings and torn fuselage that kept them alive. 60 miles, Blum said quietly. "Feels closer," Cleven murmured. "It's not." Evans' hands ached. He'd been holding the controls for hours without pause. He flexed his fingers briefly, then gripped them again. Every time he moved, the airplane reminded him who was really in charge. "Look at her," Gibson called. "Still flying straight. Still got that tail somehow." Tinian's voice came through next, rough but steady. "She's a stubborn old bird." "Guess we are too," Evans smiled faintly. "You're damn right." The P-38s were still with them, cutting lazy circles around the limping fortress. Their pilots must have been staring in disbelief, a bomber flying home with its rear almost gone, yet refusing to fall. The sun reached the horizon, and the desert turned blood red. The light caught on the shredded metal and made the All-American look like she was burning, but she wasn't. She was just shining her way home. 40 miles, Blum said. Cleven exhaled. "Almost there." Evans glanced at him. "You believe in miracles, Gale?" Cleven thought for a moment. "After today, I don't think I have a choice." As the last of the daylight faded, the radio crackled again. "All American, this is Biskra Control. You're clear for landing. Do you require a guide beacon?" Evans' voice came back calm. "Negative, Control. We can see home." The words hung in the cockpit for a long moment, soft, fragile, and full of something none of them dared to call hope. The airfield lights appeared ahead, the tiny sparks in the growing dark. The All-American groaned once more, but stayed true. 200 miles. Of sky had tried to kill her, but she was still flying, the landing that should have been impossible. The runway appeared out of the haze like a memory, long, narrow, and trembling in the heat. After all the distance, all the noise, all the waiting, home felt too small to catch them. The airfield looked like a thread across the desert, and Evans was holding a broken needle. He didn't speak. He didn't dare. His jaw was tight, his eyes steady, his hands resting lightly on the trembling yoke. Cleven sat beside him, watching the altimeter drop inch by inch. The air around them felt heavy, as if the earth itself were trying to pull them down before they were ready. "Coming up on approach," Cleven said. His voice was flat, the sound of someone who had already accepted that the outcome didn't belong to him anymore. "Gear down," Evans said. Cleven flipped the switch. The right wheel dropped into place with a clean, mechanical thud. The left one didn't. It groaned, shuddered, and stayed where it was. Left gears jammed, Evans' jaw flexed. Manual pump. Gibson was already crawling through the fuselage, the wind tearing at his clothes. He reached the pump handle near the waist and began to crank, his muscles screaming. DeBolt steadied him, gripping a steel frame with both hands as the plane vibrated. Each stroke of the pump was a fight against the shaking metal. Sweat rolled down Gibson's face and froze in the wind. Then, after what felt like forever, there was a sharp, metallic thump. "Left gear locked," Gibson shouted. Evans didn't answer. He couldn't afford distraction. The airfield was growing fast beneath them. The control tower came through the radio, the words breaking in and out. "All American, this is Biskra Control. You're cleared for landing. Emergency crews are ready." Evans pressed the transmit button but said nothing. He didn't need help. He needed precision. The airspeed dropped. The wings began to tremble. The nose wavered. The yoke felt alive under his hands, as if the airplane were warning him not to trust it too much. "Altitude?" he asked. 800 feet, Cleven said, steady. The crew had gone silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The cords holding the tail groaned and hummed, the entire rear of the plane flexing, as if it wanted to tear free one last time. Tinian was still near the brake, his knees braced, his hands gripping the supports. He looked straight ahead, past the open sky where the rest of the fuselage should have been. The wind clawed at him, screaming in his ears. He didn't move. Evans brought the throttles back a fraction. The bomber dipped slightly, gliding lower. The airframe creaked in protest. Cleven's hand hovered near the throttle levers, ready for whatever came next. The desert grew sharper, details emerging. The tents, the vehicles, the tiny figures running across the sand. The ground crews were watching, frozen in disbelief. From where they stood, the All-American looked like two separate halves, flying barely connected by faith. 200 feet, Cleven said. Evans didn't blink. "Ease her down." Cleven whispered, "I know." The runway was rushing up now. The shadow of the bomber stretched across it, distorted and trembling. Evans brought the throttles back again, inch by inch. The engines coughed. "Hold her," Cleven said. Evans' voice was barely audible. "She's holding herself." The main wheels touched the earth with a sound like thunder. The plane jolted, bounced once, then slammed down again. The entire fuselage groaned in agony, tails coming apart. Someone shouted. Evans fought the yoke, easing it forward to keep the nose level. The bomber skidded, sparks flying as the rear fuselage dragged across the dirt. The sound was unbearable, tearing, screeching, the cry of metal giving up everything it had left. "Hold together." Evans muttered through clenched teeth. The bomber shuddered once, twice, and then the tail section broke completely free. It twisted, lifted slightly, and tore away in a cloud of dust and sand, tumbling down the runway like a discarded limb. But the front half, the cockpit, the wings, the crew compartment, stayed upright. The landing gear held. The All-American rolled forward another 50 yards, slowing until finally it stopped. Silence fell. For a long moment no one moved. The engines ticked as they cooled. The wind whispered through the open fuselage, soft now, almost gentle. Cleven sat back, his hands still frozen on the throttles. "We down?" he asked quietly. Evans nodded once. "We down." Gibson laughed first, a strange, shaky laugh that broke into something like relief. The others joined him, not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only sound that made sense after surviving the impossible. Evans unbuckled his harness. His hands trembled as he reached for the canopy latch. When it opened, sunlight flooded the cockpit. The desert air smelled of dust, fuel, and life. One by one, the crew climbed out. The medics ran toward them, shouting orders that nobody heard. Denian stumbled out last, his uniform torn, his face streaked with oil and sweat. He turned and looked back at the plane, or what was left of it. The All-American sat at the edge of the runway, her back broken, her tail gone, but her nose lifted proudly toward the horizon. Cleven stood beside Evans, both men silent. Finally, Cleven said, "We actually did it." Evans looked at the wreckage, his eyes tired but steady. "She did it," he said. The crew stood there, a line of exhausted silhouettes against the glare of the desert, while ground crews and officers crowded around in awe. The air was full of questions, of disbelief, but no one could find words big enough for what they had just seen. The All-American had been a machine when she left that morning. By the time she landed, she had become something else. Proof that sometimes, in the middle of war, faith can fly farther than wings ever could. The story that wouldn't die. The noise of the engines was gone, replaced by a heavy, trembling quiet that none of them were ready for. After hours of roaring wind and straining metal, silence felt foreign, like the world had stopped to see what they'd done. The All-American sat in the sand, her nose tilted slightly upward, the back half of her body torn away. The dust around her was still rising, slowly curling through the heat. For a long time, nobody spoke. The crew stood in a half-circle, staring at the wreck that had carried them home. Evans removed his gloves and flexed his fingers. They were stiff and cracked, the skin rubbed raw where the yoke had pressed for hours. Cleven was beside him, leaning on the wing root, his uniform streaked with sweat and soot. "She shouldn't have made it," Cleven said quietly. Evans nodded. But she did. Behind them, the ground crew had begun to gather. Mechanics, medics, officers, everybody who'd been on the base had come running when the news spread. A plane had landed without its tail, someone had said. No one believed it until they saw it for themselves. Now they just stood there, wide-eyed, trying to understand the shape of the impossible in front of them. The tail section lay 100 feet down the runway, a twisted carcass of aluminum and wires. Men walked around it pointing, shaking their heads. A few of them took photographs, though their hands were shaking too much to keep the camera steady. The wind lifted the parachute cords that had held the tail together, making them dance like ribbons in the dust. Evans walked toward the back of the plane, his boots crunching over scattered fragments of metal. He reached out and touched the torn edge of the fuselage. The aluminum was warm under his hand. It had survived what no machine should have. Tinian followed him, limping slightly. His face was pale but calm. "When that German hit us," he said, "I thought we were done. I could see daylight through the floor." Evans looked at him. "So could I." They both smiled, tired, knowing smiles between men who had spent too much time with death to be surprised by it anymore. Gibson approached, his arms streaked with grease and blood that wasn't his. He carried a length of frayed cord over one shoulder, the same cord that had held the tail. "Guess this stuff was stronger than it looked," he said. "Guess we were too," Cleven answered. By afternoon, word had spread beyond the base. The operations officer came to see for himself, walking slowly around the wreck, hands behind his back. "You flew 200 miles like that?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Evans nodded once. "Yes, sir." The officer let out a long breath. "I don't think anyone's going to believe this without proof." "There's your proof," Evans said, gesturing to the broken plane. The photographer took more pictures. The men posed in front of what was left of the fuselage, not proudly, not like victors, but quietly, as though afraid that moving too much might break the spell that had saved them. In one photo, Evans is standing with a hand on the nose of the bomber, looking not at the camera but at the sky. The others are beside him, smiling faintly. None of them knew that image would travel around the world. When the photographs reached other bases, the crews stared at them like they were looking at ghosts. The story spread faster than the pictures. A bomber that had flown home in 2 pieces. A crew that refused to bail out. A plane that landed without wings. The All-American became a myth before the dust on her skin had even settled. Engineers came to examine what was left. They measured the torn aluminum, traced the lines of the brake, and tried to explain it in technical language: structural redundancy, aerodynamic lift differential, load distribution. Evans listened to their words and smiled. "You can put it any way you want," he said. She just wanted to come home. The plane was beyond repair. The mechanics stripped her of the parts that could still fly and marked the rest for scrap. But no one worked quickly. Every man who touched the fuselage did so gently, like handling something sacred. When they finally lifted the remains off the runway, the base fell quiet. The All-American had become more than a bomber. She was a memory now, carved into every man who had seen her land. Evans and his crew were reassigned within a week. There was another plane waiting, another mission, another day. That was the way of the war, no time for legends. But even when they climbed into a new fortress, something of the old one stayed with them. The hum of her engines, the rattle of the cords, the whisper of a tale that refused to fall. Some of the men went home after the war. Some didn't, but those who did carried the same story. Told the same words in quiet rooms, about the plane that came back when she shouldn't have, and the day the sky ran out of ways to kill them. Years later, when the photographs surfaced again in newspapers and museums, the story found new life. Historians wrote about it, engineers studied it, and pilots called it luck. But to the 10 men who had been there, luck wasn't enough of a word. They knew what it had felt like to sit in that broken fuselage, the world howling through the holes, the tail swaying behind them like a ghost. They knew what it meant to believe that the plane itself wanted to live. The All-American was more than steel and rivets. She was proof that sometimes the difference between falling and flying isn't physics, it's faith.